American people. So, as I said, we're going to start today on a project that is for, I hope, the enrichment of the people. And I'm going to start by going over what would have been the beginning of my intent to do something like this in this particular manner. First, I'm going to reveal that in the course of this research I followed up on, or the course of this project, I followed up on something I had done previously, which is I found some publications on microfiche in the public library. And my understanding is that the microfiche is a reproduction of what would have actually been the publication put into circulation in print form at the time. I found some publications concerning my date of birth, which is May 15th of 1977. And I looked through those publications and I found some very interesting information, including information that was connected to what I understood to be these cycles that had been ongoing in my life and became very, very significant, especially around 2007, between 2007 and around 2010, and then ended up becoming more, shall we say, comprehensive and intensive within the last 5 years. Almost as if there were memes that were connected to information I found in those publications at the time, and that also had a form of documentation of events that had occurred that were very similar to events I had experienced in my life. At some point, I also did some examination of the same publications, but for the 3 years previous to my birth. And it just so happens that the last time I did this was on March 13th of 2020. I have those written notes here, including the transcription of an article that is very, very profound and that I believe is actually very specific to what was discussed in the introduction. Now, as we move forward, I will discuss this more. I believe it is something that perhaps other people could do for themselves if they so desired to, and that it should be something that's available to us, and honestly, should have been a service that had already been provided to us in our lives, including in connection with any expectation that we were going to take on any financial obligations, whether they be obligations associated with performance in terms of a public responsibility, whether or not we decided to run for office or just engage in some other form of ordinary political process, or whether we intended to have some sort of private life, including a private life that might involve a need for financing. It's, to be honest with you, something I don't understand. Why this isn't a very basic part of whatever would be considered financial education for the people of the United States. I believe it should happen. I believe it should be a requirement, and so I will do my best to provide an example of what I would have hoped somebody would have done for me, and that if I were to be able to, I would be happy to help other people with. I will also say that part of these considerations, including one's going, that could potentially go back to one's birth or be connected to one's birth, including potentially the issuance of their first birth certificate, are very important in terms of understanding how the birth certificate and primary identification documents are, as I understand, a actual form of security that is connected to a variety of other financial processes that are not readily disclosed to us and that may or may not impact what our possibilities are otherwise. For the purposes, however, of this endeavor, which I'm hoping will be something that the public is engaged in, I am going to start with specific documents, one of which has, some of which have very important dates today and coming up in the next couple of days. And from here, we're going to go through a process that was something I had conceived of in my own understanding of a way to start, a sort of foundation for trying to locate myself personally and try to figure out how to reacquire or re access things that for whatever reason seemed to have been closed off to me, but made more sense when one understood them in the context of larger macro considerations that may or may not have influenced how the decisions I made impacted my possibilities thereafter. To start, I began with a very basic process. One of the things I had attempted to do, which will be reflected, is attempted to engage through the judicial process in order to seek redress for crimes that I had both witnessed and been subjected to. I was denied a lawyer and was denied any actual consultation with anybody that was alleged to be legally eligible to practice law for actually this entire time. And prior to that, I had attempted to report to formally to various agencies, what I understood to be fraud, specifically fraud involving homeless and domestic violence shelters and the way they factored into larger systems of resource acquisition in municipalities, specifically in Chicago, but also in some of the suburbs of Chicago, some of the western suburbs of Chicago. Now, I'm somebody that was formerly a journalist. It covered urban issues, including an election spread for a particular season, including real estate issues, including political issues connected to economic policy, including housing issues and the intersection of the public housing sector with the rest of the city's municipality. I'm also somebody that had previously worked for law firms, including a law firm that provided real estate and estate planning for people in a very, what I understood to be pioneering manner. I'd also worked as somebody who had been in compliance as well as operations and facilities management in a basic entry level but also very important administrative role concerning a city and county public health department, and had a basic understanding of the laws and policies, ones where people were required to adhere to in order to be eligible to receive the funding that they expected to be able to receive. Now, in the state of Illinois, at the time this happened, I understood things were complicated because there was a very intensive political volleying going on regarding local access to resources in the context of a form of consideration by the governor of Illinois' refusal to approve a budget. And this budget had implications in terms of what was able to be availed of by people in the municipalities where I was trying to seek resources. However, it wasn't just state resources they were attempting to receive or things that would have been appropriated through the Illinois state budget, but also things that would have been directly connected to programs they had access to that were appropriated for through the federal government. And one was legally allowed to seek redress for their experiences of policy violations and other harms and infractions that had happened to them through the reporting structures associated with those federal agencies as well as their state and local affiliates. And that's what I did. Once I was compelled to leave Illinois and came to Texas, the situations I experienced accelerated and they increased. And my concern is that what had happened is the people in Texas already knew that I was a sort of upstart in their perspective based on what had happened in Illinois, and that people in Illinois had actually communicated with people in Texas. So when I got to Texas, it escalated. And the attempts to try to engage me in conscious efforts to cooperate with crime also escalated. That is why I decided to pursue it through the judicial branch and actually go through a formal legal process, starting with the state of Texas and its responsibility. Again, during this time, I've been denied any sort of legal representation. I've also been denied any sort of financial representation, including after numerous reports of securities fraud, including securities fraud involving theft of my primary source documents, such as my social security card, my state IDs and driver's licenses, and more than one birth certificate. So, let's start with what I had on March 11th, 2021, and where it ended up going. I'm going to show you 3 documents, and then I'm going to show you a 4th in the order of their dates. Now, the first one I have here is dated for March 12th of 2020, and 1-year anniversary would be tomorrow. It was from the U.S. Census, and it was sent to the address at which I live. It's a general request for, this is your invitation to respond to the 2020 census. It has your census ID number in a box. It says to respond by April 1st. It gives you the website, gives you the census ID number, and it also has the specific date on here. The date, it was received in the mailbox, and it was dated for March 12th, 2020. Then I did not at that time actually look online or do anything online with the census, but I kept it. I did discuss with the other person who lives here, and then in the mail there was another follow-up. This follow-up is dated for March 16th, 2020. As you can see, it's pretty much the same format as the other one, but the first one came with a sheet that had different information on different languages. And one of the things it says on here is there is an OMB number, and it says the approval expires November 30th, 2021. Now, OMB numbers are something we'll be talking about so far as I understand, and something that I have been trying to keep track of myself. Again, on the form it also has the same OMB number, which is right here, and this was delivered with this. The other one, however, as you can see, this is a bifold. This was folded in half and came in what would be a half-page envelope. The other one was not. It was a trifold. This is how it came. It came in what would be considered a letter-size envelope, and the addition was not included. The addition about the other languages was not included. Additionally, as you can see, on the first one, on the back, there's a FAQ. There is a FAQ on the back of the first one that came with this, but on the second one, dated for March 16th, there's no FAQ. Okay, so it just came in the envelope with no additional language instruction and nothing about the FAQ. Then the third information is a postcard. In this postcard, as you can see, it's from the Census Bureau. It's blue. And again, both of these are blue too, right? And this one is blue. It has the same number that is identified as the census ID number for this address. And it is dated for March 26th of 2020. Now, when I got the second one for March 16th of 2020, March 16th of 2020 was the day the official declaration of a state of emergency in Texas was announced by the then alleged governor, Greg Abbott, as being the appropriate response concerning what was being reported as being the situation concerning COVID-19. And when that happened, and then this came a few days later, I said to myself that I was concerned that there might be some sort of correlation between these and something that might be going on with Treasury, as if there was a more, shall we say, comprehensive intent upon the specific dating. Why would one be dated for March 12th and then one be dated for 4 days later? 4 days is not a time frame that I had much familiarity with in terms of mandated reporting or in terms of an acceptable concept of what would be the frequency around which to alert people or to make people apprised of situations. So when this came a little later, which is 10 days after the first one, by that time I said, okay, I'm going to do the census today. I talked to my roommate, I got the information. And I did something very specific with the electronic reporting of the census, which wasn't meant to be inaccurate, but was meant to specifically respond to the question as it was asked on the electronic census form. I did it on the day I received the postcard, I have that information in my evidence. What happened was when you go to the website and you go onto the website to do the census and you put in the census ID, they have the questions come up. Immediately after submitting the electronic version of your census response, they send you a receipt. And the receipt has a specific, very, very detailed information. How long it took you to do the census, the exact time you finished, as well as a number, almost as if it's a receipt number on the electronic transaction that occurred, corollary to the actual provision of that census information and census data. Now, my reflections on taking the census online were that some of the questions were intentionally ambiguous and that there was information that was being requested that had, shall we say, multiple manners in which it can be interpreted. And this is something that's been happening for a considerable amount of time. It was also being done in a context of an increased effort to promote this understanding of surveys and using surveys following some sort of engagement with an online forum that I understand was being financialized. As a matter of fact, once they started to do the quarantines regarding COVID-19, people like me were getting these offers to participate in these jobs associated with filling out surveys online. You got some money per survey to fill it out. And you may or may not be eligible for the survey depending upon the way you answered questions about your demographic information. I became concerned initially because a majority of these surveys that were being sent to me in the United States were identified as being connected to organizations that were operating out of either London or other countries in Europe. And my concern was, why are European countries attempting to solicit people to be employed with survey companies at this period of time? It was as if there was a campaign. And I will bring this part up as we move forward in consideration of my concerns regarding things ongoing with the pension system, both the domestic pension system and changes that have been happening to pension systems in other parts of the world. But the point of the matter is, as I filled out the survey online as soon as I got this, which was within a 3 to 4 day period of its date, I got the receipt. I downloaded the receipt. It was in my email. Within a month, that email was gone. And it's currently not in my email. The actual electronic receipt of me receiving the confirmation on filling out the U.S. Census survey was not in my email, at least the last time I checked, which was since, I believe, December of 2020. I've checked several times. And I had printed out the information and I had put it into my electronic evidence at the time as a record. What I understood was that there was a very specific sequence that connected all of these dates. Now, what would have happened if I had not filled out the online electronic survey on the day that I got this postcard? Well, I don't have the receipt for it, at least online, at least in my electronic records that are accessible to me now. I do have information about what I did in my electronic records as backup, which I call evidence. What I realized is that there was a notice that Treasury had issued a 30-year bond. And the original notice for the bond was on March 5th of 2020, and the issuance was on March 16th. So this one is dated for March 12th, and this one is dated for March 16th. My concern was that these were actually confirmation on a bond, and that somebody was using these solicitations for the census as part of what they were putting into effect with this 30-year bond. Now, why would the Department of Commerce, which is where the U.S. Census is located, be doing that? Is it possible that they did that? I went on a theory that they were. And so by the time this one came, this is 10 days later from what would have been the notice that would have confirmed the 30-year bond. My major concern is that what the 10-day period is often connected to executive compensation packages that are associated with laws connected to the specific legislation is associated with the ERISA, but it is connected to an understanding of retirement benefits and other kinds of benefits that go into compensation for executives at various companies. My theory or my concern, what I was trying to see whether or not would pan out in the next year as my theory, was that they were bonding the census to a 30-year bond. These would have been the initial documents, the actual paper. Who got it? Who filled out the census at that time? And then there's a postcard reminder 10 days later. Well, 10 days later, we're talking about a 52-week bill, which comes due on March 26th of 2021, right? The day of issue was March 26th, 2020. This was the date upon which the receipt for my effort to contact the census would have been reflected. Now, I did not know about all of this specifically until after I did it. But I knew as soon as I got this dated for 10 days after this, that I was already concerned about the 4-day correlation between these two documents, and that this came dated for 10 days later. That's when I decided today's the day I'm going to fill out the census electronically, because my theory is that what they were doing was using those receipts or those specific censuses that would be tailored to this postcard as somebody's executive compensation. If I was correct with what was actually going on with COVID-19 and the alleged emergency relief process, as opposed to actually going through with a formal and verifiable appropriations process, including that addressed outstanding matters that by last year had already been attempted for some sort of formal judicial review and some sort of formal inquest into consideration of for 2.5 years formally by me at least. But my understanding was that there were other people that had these concerns, including going back further, but specifically concerning a pattern of racketeering activity that had been present and had been demonstrable through House Concurrent Resolution 71 of 2017 for implementation in 2018, that what was happening is they were intentionally setting up a situation to allow for a compelled insolvency of certain aspects of the federal government operations, with an understanding at some point they were going to be put into some form of receivership or conservatorship to be offloaded to the private sector, and that somebody was going to get their executive compensation based on demographic information that was made available through the census, and that correlated with changes that were apparent in various municipal pension schemes that were also part of the pattern of racketeering activity. Now, I would like for this to be something that would be more educational about how we can take fiscal responsibility. But if, as I contend, there is significant corruption that is allowing for misrepresentations of the constitutional process around appropriations and budgeting for the federal government, we are in a process where we are being force collectivized so that our lives and our capabilities can be redistributed to other people that have already curried political favor through actions that have occurred in the last couple of years, including illegal lobbying or aiding and abetting acts of election fraud, then what we need to do is we need to verify and authenticate as we can and with what we have available where and how it is being accomplished so we can identify the culprits and shut them down. And this is where I started. Now, these two documents would have been tomorrow would have been the day of the correlation for these two. And then the consideration becomes how to understand these, especially if there is a suspicion or a concern about executive compensation or some attempt to manipulate executive compensation. And that gets into the fourth document. As you can see, This was just put in the mailbox. There's no address on here. It was in the mailbox one day. This wasn't sent in the mail. This wasn't postmarked. There's no time and date stamping on it. The reference that it has, however, is right here. There's a number at the bottom, which implies that it is some sort of formal printing or issue, and it has been selected for distribution in Dallas. I don't know if you can see that. It says Dallas right here at the end, SCF Dallas. There's a number. But the important part is how it's dated. March 16th of 2020, which is the date of this letter, and which would have been the date of issuance on that 30-year bond. So this is part of the concern I have, because March 16th was also the date of a 10-year note that came out that correlates not with March 12th, but with March 11th. And so the question is, well, what would have been something that could have been in a sequence, or that would have been a part of a serialization that might have been connected to public notices or actual issuances of official government documents that would be able to help one understand what the anticipated obligations or commitments were in accordance with this specific postcard. This postcard does not have, it wasn't canceled in the mail, it wasn't sent in the mail. My understanding is that they were issued in mass to the local post offices that just put them in the mailboxes. Well, who ended up getting them? And at the same time, I did some information, and this is where it got very significant. The information and the specific information that is presumably in the name of the White House and the CDC is different than the information that was presented at the time as part of media representations of what the CDC was saying, the appropriate actions to engage around coronavirus. So the next concern became one of, is there some effort to try to influence the people and create disinformation in consideration of some sort of competition for an understanding of how to respond to COVID-19 between the Office of the White House and other people, including people in executive agencies like the CDC. So what do? The best thing I could think to do at the time was I looked at executive actions that were undertaken by Donald Trump and that were available on the White House website at the time. And I have here listed what at the time were executive actions for March 5th, 2020, March 11th, 2020, March 12th of 2020, and March 16th of 2020. My concern or my query was, is there a correlation? Is there a specific and strategic means by which these executive actions were taken that could have been cross-referenced with these particular documents and what their implications are? And that's what we're going to be discussing, or that's where we're going to be starting tomorrow. It is 11:55 a.m. on March 11, 2021.